In the middle of August, there is one thing I do in the apiary, and it takes about 10 minutes. From each hive, I pull the frame at the center of the brood nest, hold it up to the light, and look. Not at how much honey is on it, not at how many bees are covering it, not even at the capped brood. What I am looking at is simpler than any of those. Whether the queen has empty cells to lay in. Because the bees that need to be made right now are the ones that will carry the colony through winter. And if there is no room on that frame, they will not be made at all. It took me an embarrassing number of seasons to work out that this was the check that mattered, and rather longer to work out why nobody had told me. What follows is what that frame is actually reporting, why the same picture means opposite things 6 weeks apart, and what to do about it while there is still time for doing anything to help. Most beekeepers looking at a brood frame in August are looking for the wrong thing, and I was one of them for years. A contracted brood nest in mid-August is normal. The queen reduces her laying as the days shorten, and workers begin filling emptied cells with nectar and pollen, which makes the pattern look patchier than it is. Neither of those is a problem on its own. But hidden inside that same picture is a distinction that decides the winter, and the two situations can sit on the same frame at the same time. If this biology first breakdown is useful to you, a like helps more beekeepers find it. The difficulty is that the reassuring reading and the alarming one produce almost identical frames. A colony contracting on schedule and a colony that has been shut out of its own brood nest both show a smaller patch of brood in mid-August than they showed in June. And from a meter away, they are indistinguishable. Everything in this video comes down to the detail that separates them, and it is not the one most people look at. That is the part worth being patient with, because getting it wrong in either direction costs something. Correcting a colony that was contracting normally wastes effort and disturbs a hive that was fine. Leaving one that was shut out costs the winter. Here is the check itself, because it costs nothing and you can do it this week. Pull the center frame of the brood nest, not an outer frame, the middle one, and look at the area where the queen is currently working. You are asking one question. Are there open cells in there for her to use? Look for eggs, and look for brood in more than one stage, which tells you she has been laying continuously rather than in a single burst. A pattern that is smaller than it was in June, but solid and consistent within the area she is working is a good sign. A pattern that is smaller because every cell around it is full of nectar is a different situation entirely. Do the whole row rather than one hive, because, as with most things in an apiary, the comparison carries more information than any single reading. Colonies under the same forage and the same weather that are behaving differently are telling you something, and it is usually about their own history rather than about the season. There is a second reading available while the frame is in your hands, and it costs nothing extra. Notice how much pollen is stored around the brood. A colony rearing winter bees needs it close by, and a brood area ringed entirely by nectar with no pollen band is short of the other thing those bees are built from. Before we go further, one small and genuine request. If this is useful to you, subscribing genuinely helps. It signals that careful, historically grounded beekeeping is worth showing to more people. In the comments, it would be good to know, when you inspect in August, what are you actually looking for on the frame? And if you would like to support the work more directly, joining the channel is a little like buying us a coffee. No grand promises, just a way to help keep these breakdowns coming. That is all. Now, back to the bees. The answers people give to that question reveal more about how they were taught than almost anything else. The reason this particular frame matters more in August than at any other point in the year comes down to what the colony is making. The bees being raised now are not ordinary summer bees. They are the generation that has to survive from autumn until the first pollen of spring. Physiologically different, longer-lived, and produced in a narrow window that runs from roughly August through October in most temperate climates. Everything about winter survival depends on that generation being made in adequate numbers and in good condition. That narrow window is what makes August different from every other month. In April, a queen kept short of laying space costs you a few weeks of buildup and some frustration. In August, the same restriction costs you the bees that were supposed to be alive in February. And there is no second attempt because the window closes on its own schedule. Everything else in autumn management is preparation for a colony that already exists. This is the making of the colony itself. There are 3 requirements for making them well, and 2 of them get almost all the attention. The colony has to be clean, because mites feeding on developing bees damage exactly the reserves that define a winter bee. It has to be well fed, because those reserves are built from protein, and protein comes from pollen. Both of those are worth every minute spent on them. But there is a third requirement that is more basic than either, and it is barely discussed. The queen has to have somewhere to lay. A colony can be perfectly clean and perfectly fed and still fail to produce a winter generation, for the simple reason that there were no empty cells. Reading it that way also explains something that puzzled me for a long time, which is why colonies that had been treated properly and fed properly still came out of winter thin. I had been checking 2 of the 3 requirements carefully, and never checking the third at all. And a chain of 3 does not care which link you neglected. The 3 requirements are also not interchangeable, which is worth saying because beekeepers instinctively compensate. Extra feeding does not make up for a closed brood nest, and neither does a clean mite count. That third requirement is what beekeepers call being honeybound, and it is worth stating plainly that in August, this is a genuine problem rather than a curiosity or a spring-only concern. A colony can be strong, heavy, well-fed, and thoroughly clean, and still be quietly failing to produce the only generation of bees that matters at this point in the year, for no reason other than that every cell is occupied. The word itself is part of why it gets dismissed. Honeybound sounds like a spring problem, and in most beekeeping conversation, that is exactly how it is used. A swarming precursor, something to correct in May. Applied to August, it describes a different failure, with a different consequence, and no dramatic symptom to announce it. The mechanism is straightforward once you see how the season stacks up. A honeybound hive is one that has stored so much nectar or syrup that it runs out of room outside the brood area and begins filling the brood nest, which leaves the queen with nowhere to lay. In spring, the consequence is swarming. In August, the consequence is different and quieter. The colony simply does not make the bees it needs. There is no dramatic event, no cells hanging from the frames, nothing to find at an inspection except a brood nest that is smaller than it should be, for reasons that look seasonal. It is the absence of drama that makes it so easy to miss. A honeybound colony in spring tells you loudly by building queen cells and preparing to leave. The August version says nothing at all. There is no swarm, no queen cells, no unusual behavior at the entrance, and no obvious symptom to find. The colony simply produces fewer bees than it should have, which nobody notices until it is a small cluster in January. There is a further reason it escapes notice, which is that the beekeeper is usually looking at the wrong hive. Attention in August goes to the colonies that look weak. A honeybound colony is typically one of the strongest in the yard, heavy, populous, thriving by every visible measure, which puts it at the bottom of any one list of things to worry about. And this is where it gets genuinely difficult. because the same appearance means opposite things depending on the date. In late autumn, backfilling the brood nest with nectar is the final step in a colony's winter preparation. It is what you want. It is a survival behavior, and correcting it would be a mistake. In August, it is a problem. The guidance that makes the most sense of this is specific about the calendar. From roughly February through September, the queen should have multiple brood frames, or at least a few frames that are 2/3 empty in the lower brood box, and the brood nest filling with stores is only acceptable in late fall. And even then, some frames should remain at least half open. That calendar detail is the whole reason this subject is so muddled in the beekeeping literature. Two beekeepers can look at photographs of identical frames and disagree completely, and both be right. Because one is describing August and the other is describing October, and neither has said so. The practical version of that guidance is easier to carry than the dates. Through the active season, the queen should always have somewhere to go, and only at the very end of it does filling the brood nest become the objective rather than the problem. So the same frame that would worry me on the 15th of August would reassure me on the 15th of October. That is not a contradiction, and it is not a matter of opinion. It is the colony doing two entirely different jobs 6 weeks apart, and the beekeeper's reading has to move with it. Getting the date wrong on this is the single commonest way to misread an August frame, in either direction, correcting something that was working or leaving something that was not. It is also the reason a beekeeper who reads a single article about backfilling can come away with confident advice that is exactly wrong for the month they are standing in. The part that took me longest to accept is how often the beekeeper causes it. There are two reliable routes. The first is at harvest, pulling supers and then closing the colony down onto fewer boxes than it needs. So a strong colony with incoming nectar has nowhere to put anything except the brood nest. The second is feeding, which I covered separately, and which matters here for a specific reason. A hive that has been fed steadily through a dearth is a hive receiving nectar it was not receiving naturally, and that syrup has to go somewhere. Heavy or extended feeding in late summer is one of the commonest ways to fill a brood nest that the colony would otherwise have kept open. Both of those routes have something in common that took me a while to notice. They are the beekeeper adding nectar to a system, or removing the space it was going to go into, at exactly the point in the year when the colony most needs empty comb. Neither feels like a mistake at the time. Both look like diligence. The harvest version in particular is worth spelling out, because it is so easy to do without noticing. Pulling supers at the end of the flow and reducing a colony to 2 boxes is standard practice, and usually correct. Doing it to a colony that is still bringing in a late flow, or one being fed, removes the space that nectar was going to occupy, and hands it the brood nest instead. There is also a version that has nothing to do with the beekeeper at all, and it is worth knowing because the fix is different. A late flow, goldenrod, aster, knapweed, whatever runs in your area after the main crop, can fill a brood nest fast in a strong colony with no space above it. That is not a management error. It is a good problem in the sense that the colony is bringing in stores it will need, but it is still a problem if it closes the laying area during the winter bee window, and the answer is space rather than restraint. The distinction matters because the correction differs. A colony filled by a late natural flow needs somewhere to put what it is bringing in, and taking frames out without adding space just gets them refilled within a fortnight. A colony filled by feeding needs the feeding to stop first, and often needs nothing else at all. Both situations look the same on the frame. Only the history distinguishes them, which is why knowing what you have been doing to the colony matters as much as what you can see. What I look for on that center frame is therefore a specific pattern rather than a general impression. Eggs present, which tells me she is laying now rather than a fortnight ago. Brood in several stages, which tells me she has been laying continuously. And empty cells within the area she is working, which tells me she can carry on. Reasonable coverage within that active area matters more than the total size of it. A small solid patch is a working colony contracting normally, while a small patch surrounded by wall-to-wall nectar is a colony that has been shut down. That distinction between a small solid patch and a small crowded one is the entire diagnosis, and it took me far too long to see it, largely because I was looking at the brood rather than at what surrounded it. A frame can be 2/3 honey and still be fine if the third that is not honey is where the queen is working. Size is not the signal. The distinction between those two shows up in one detail more than any other, and it is the thing I check when I am unsure. Look at what is immediately adjacent to the brood. If the cells bordering the laying area are open or hold a little pollen, the queen has somewhere to expand into, and the contraction is her decision. If the brood is ringed by capped and uncapped nectar with no gap between, the contraction was imposed on her. Same frame, same size patch, two entirely different situations, and the difference is visible in about 5 seconds once you know to look at the border rather than the center. I now think of it as reading the border rather than the pattern. The pattern tells you what the queen has done. The border tells you what she can do next. And in August, what she can do next is the only part that still matters. It also makes the check fast enough to do properly on every hive, rather than on the 2 you happen to be worried about, which is where its real value sits. When a colony is genuinely honeybound in August, the correction is space rather than cleverness. If the lower box still has 3 or 4 frames of brood and the rest is full, it is often enough to stop feeding and add a box. The bees will move food upward and free space for the queen. Where it is more advanced, frames of solid honey come out of the brood area and empty drawn comb goes in beside the brood. The removed frames are not wasted. They can be set aside for winter feed or placed well away from the apiary to be robbed out and the empty comb reinserted. Where the colony has a genuinely full lower box and no space anywhere, the more direct intervention is to remove 2 or 3 solid frames from the brood area and replace them with drawn, empty comb placed directly beside the existing brood. Drawn comb, rather than foundation, matters here, because there is little wax being produced in August, and a frame of foundation in a dearth is a frame the queen cannot use for some time. The frames that come out are not a loss. Solid, capped honey removed from a brood box in August is exactly what that colony will want fed back to it in October. And setting it aside for that purpose is simpler than most alternatives. 2 cautions on that, because both of them can turn a fix into a fresh problem. Do not open the brood nest so aggressively that you split it in cool weather. The colony still has to keep what brood it has warm, and August nights are not August afternoons. And be careful where you put anything you take out. Frames of honey set down in an apiary during a dearth are the most effective robbing trigger available, which is why the standard advice is to place them at a distance rather than beside the hive, and why doing this work at dusk, with entrances reduced, is worth the small inconvenience. Both cautions come down to the same thing. An intervention aimed at helping a colony through the winter bee window should not itself cost brood or invite a robbing event during the most vulnerable weeks of the year. Neither caution is theoretical. Both describe mistakes that are easy to make while doing something genuinely helpful, which is the most frustrating category of error in beekeeping. I should be honest about a limit here, because a title that says 1 frame decides the winter is doing some work. That frame does not literally determine the outcome on its own. A colony can have perfect laying space and still fail from mites, or from starvation, or from a queen that gives out in October. What the frame tells you is whether one of the 3 requirements for making winter bees is being met, and it happens to be the one nobody checks, and the one most easily fixed once seen. 2 of the 3 are already on most beekeepers' August list. This is the missing item, not the whole list. I would rather state that limit clearly than have a beekeeper check one frame, find it open, and conclude the colony is set for winter. It is one of 3 things, all of which need to be true, and the other 2 have been covered separately for good reason. The frame check earns its place on the list precisely because it is cheap, quick, and currently missing from most people's list, not because it outranks the other 2. There is a timing element that makes the check worth doing now rather than later, and it is the reason I do it in the middle of the month rather than at the end. Corrections take time to work through. A frame of open comb inserted today gives the queen somewhere to lay tomorrow, and the bees from those eggs emerge 3 weeks after that, still inside the window when winter bees are being made. The same correction applied in late September gives her space at a point when she is winding down anyway, and produces bees that arrive too late to matter. The fix is easy. The fix is only easy in August. That is the argument for doing it now rather than adding it to the autumn list where it would naturally sit. Almost everything else in autumn preparation can be done late and still count. This one cannot, because it is not a preparation at all. It is a condition for producing something, and the producing happens on a fixed schedule. 3 weeks is the figure to hold in mind, because it is the gap between an egg laid and a bee emerging, and it is what determines whether a correction made today produces a bee that counts. What strikes me looking back is that this was invisible to me for years, precisely because it does not look like anything. Mites announce themselves eventually. A failing queen announces herself. Robbing is unmistakable. A colony with no laying space simply looks like a colony with a small brood nest in late summer, which is exactly what a healthy colony also looks like, and the difference is a border of open cells that nobody told me to look at. I lost colonies to it and recorded the cause as something else, more than once. That is the general shape of the failures I find hardest to catch, and it is worth naming. The problems that look identical to health are the ones that survive inspection. Anything dramatic gets noticed eventually. It is the quiet failure that resembles a normal seasonal pattern that gets recorded as something else and repeats the following year. It is also why the same lesson gets learned repeatedly by the same beekeeper across different problems, because the pattern is about visibility rather than about any particular subject. So the whole thing, if it is useful, pull the center brood frame in mid-August, look for eggs, look for multiple stages, and look at whether the cells bordering the brood are open or packed. If she has room, close up and move on. If she does not, stop feeding if you are feeding. Give the colony space above, and if it is far enough gone, take solid frames out of the brood area and put drawn comb in beside the brood, carefully, at dusk, with entrances reduced and nothing left standing in the apiary. Then check the same frame a fortnight later to see whether she took the space. None of that requires equipment beyond a few frames of drawn comb, and the check itself requires nothing at all. Most colonies pass it, which is the point. The 10 minutes are spent confirming that most of the yard needs nothing and finding the 1 or 2 hives that do. The follow-up check a fortnight later matters as much as the first one, because it tells you whether the colony actually used the space you gave it. A queen who has not moved into fresh comb after 2 weeks is telling you something the first inspection could not. The reason I do this in mid-August rather than at the end of the season is that by the end of the season, the answer has already been decided, and there is nothing useful left to do about it. A colony that could not lay in August arrives in October looking thin for reasons that will seem mysterious, and the beekeeper will reach for explanations that have nothing to do with a frame nobody pulled. When you inspect in August, what are you actually looking for on the frame, and have you ever found a colony with plenty of stores and no room to lay? Leave your experience in the comments. Subscribe for more historically grounded beekeeping, and if you want the full breakdown of what makes a winter bee physiologically different from a summer bee, that one is next. The check costs 10 minutes across a whole apiary, and it is the only one on the August list that gets harder to act on with every week it is delayed.